All right, welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is English Colonies in the 17th Century. Now, we're going to have a couple of these because the process of understanding kind of how the English go about this, especially in the Americas, is a difficult one. All right, so this is part one of a 2 or 3 part series. All right, so again, we're going to talk about 5 terms that you got to know kind of as you do your reading and you do everything else. So, first term, 1607. Right, 1607. Now, the usual kind of thing these days in both K through 12, later kind of, and especially in higher education is to tell folks that, dates don't matter. You don't need to know dates. You don't need to know all of them, but you need to kind of have a basic understanding of a couple, kind of things to kind of string us together back and forth, right? When it comes to the colonial period, there's a couple, that you got to know. And certainly 1607 is a big one. And the reason that 1607 is a big one for our purposes is because this is the year that the English arrive in modern Virginia and will begin establishing their settlement at Jamestown. Now, Jamestown was a difficult settlement that was built, one of privation and conflict from the get-go, and one that generally, if you could get in a time machine and go back, I don't think I'd go. Something like, was it 2/3, 3/4 of everybody in the first 10 years who goes dies? It's rough. It demonstrates the role of disease and warfare and privation, and it's a real complex situation. Point 2, John Smith. So, John Smith is kind of a soldier of fortune character who's given a position of leadership by something called the Virginia Company and winds up kind of taking over colonial authority for a short period. He's famous in a modern context because Disney made a movie about Pocahontas. And the tough thing, of course, is that Disney kind of takes a story that isn't really there and makes it into something that, if it was real, we'd have a problem with today in the 21st century. John Smith was in his late 20s, early 30s. Pocahontas, if this was a real love story, she was like 12, right? So this would be more like an episode of Datelines to Catch a Predator than anything else. All right, number 3, joint stock companies. Joint stock companies. So I mentioned the Virginia Company a second ago. So early 17th century England, along with many other kingdoms and communities that in Western Europe that are going to begin a process of colonial exploration, they create these corporatized institutions, these corporate institutions, these kind of in some cases fully private, in some cases joint efforts with the government to go out and explore and to kind of take possession of areas, brutalize people, obviously, is a big part of this, and then to extract wealth and resources. So joint stock companies were a common way in which American colonies are ultimately formed. They occur in different ways, right? They exist in different ways. So again, some are private, some are government, government run by the government. Colonies are, but joint stock companies themselves are usually private. All right, number 4, indentured servants. All right, so the economic difficulties that existed in England in the 17th century meant you had a number of individuals who were looking for outlets away from their agricultural communities that they had grown up in. Right, so they would make their way to a city, say Bristol or another area, and would eventually try to get passage to the Americas. Now, most couldn't afford it, and so their passage would be paid for by an individual who would purchase their indenture contract upon arrival in, say, a place like Jamestown. So indentured servants were contract laborers who would serve for typically a period of 3 to 4 years. They're in their late teens, early 20s usually. It's mostly young men, although some women were indentures. And the process that they endured was a difficult one. Now, we need to make sure that we make this point clear, though. Indentured servitude was difficult, was no picnic by any stretch of the imagination. And it was the majority of experiences for English individuals coming as migrants to the Americas in the 17th century. But it's not African slavery. Okay, it's not the enslavement of individuals from the continent of Africa and that process. They're not the same. No. Number 5, Plymouth. We tend to think of the foundational colonial story in the U.S. as one certainly of American exceptionalism and one as America being singularly founded as a nation hell-bent on the preservation, particularly of Protestant Christianity, and that this was ubiquitous across all colonies. No, the experience in the colonies vary. Yeah, the folks who come to Plymouth, they are pilgrims seeking to be able to have a safe place to practice their faith. Now, that's cool. Now, some of their faith isn't really tolerant of other faiths, which we have a problem with in the 21st century, and that kind of stuff. But Plymouth is a big deal, partly because of the legacies of colonialism and the creation of Massachusetts and all these kinds of things. But Plymouth in 1620. All right, thank you so much.